Nice to recording in progress. I've got it. And nice to speak to you guys. Just a bit about me in this presentation. This presentation I wrote this year, and I've given it an awful lot. I don't know how many times now, 40 times or something. But it was written for a more general audience and radio audience, and you guys are a bit more specialist, so you'll probably chuckle or find fault or get bored halfway through. I'm not sure which, but hopefully you'll raise a smile. A little bit about me. I'm G3 ZPS. I've held that call since 1970 when I was 16. And if you work a G3 on the air, there aren't that many who are my age, because I'm right at the end of the G3 calls. They ran out early 1971. The G3 started after the Second World War. They've been reissued some since, but it's rare for me to work a G3. It's actually younger than me at 67. Most of the G3s I work on the air are older, so that's me. I'm a qualified professional engineer, RF design engineer, although I went into management in the end. I'm a fellow of the IET and a member of the Cray Valley Radio Society Committee down here in London. And that's one of the biggest clubs. We're just shy of 140 members at the moment. Now, I'm not going to cover every bit of antique radio gear that is in existence. It's impossible. So if I don't mention something that you hold dear to your heart, then you know, it's you know, we know about it, but I just can't, you know, I can't cover it all. I have people at the end saying, you didn't mention the Mini Mitter MR44. No, I'm sorry, I didn't, and it's not in the presentation. So this is something that probably some of you will find absolutely dear to you. This is a health warning, which I give to most clubs, is before we start, if this is your idea of a ham radio set with an Icom 73, whatever it is, I haven't got any of those, and a laptop and a microphone and a power plug, then maybe this presentation isn't for you. And if you get frightened by something like this, maybe this presentation isn't for you. That isn't my garage. I'm not sure whose it is, but you know, mine could easily have ended up like that. Maybe it does look like that now. I haven't been out there for a few days. And once you start collecting and playing with old things, radio gear in this case, and radio gear, it doesn't matter what it is, you know, it can lead down a very, very slippery slope indeed. Here's Greg. This is an American cartoon. Greg's gone off to the ham auction, she says on the phone, to get rid of some old radios that were cluttering up, and there in the background is Greg coming back from the radio rally with even more that he took, and that relates directly to me and a lot of my vintage radio collector friends. And if things get really bad, of course, you can end up like George, W9VT. This is George, who's and that's only one of George's rooms. Some of you may have looked him up on, if you haven't looked him up, look up his page on QRZ. That's just one of the rooms. I mean, George's museum, for want of a better word, is bigger than my entire house, garden, property. It's absolutely enormous. I dread to think what George's electricity bill is, but there's not much there that's ever existed in ham radio kit, vintage kit that George doesn't own. I've never found anything he doesn't own. So where did all this, just a bit of history where sort of things started, and as I said, I give this to people who perhaps don't understand about the early history of radio. Between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War was a period of incredibly fast technology change. We went from fairly basic valve engineering around the First World War, and it was used in aircraft, Marconi mainly, but others, all the way through to the beginning of the Second World War, and just about all of the aspects of thermionic valve design and the way they work and their limitations to be overcome have been worked through in that 25 year period. So, and there's the EF50, which is in one of my other presentations as well, which look up the history of the EF50 and its role in radar and how we managed to rescue it from rescue some from Philips in Eindhoven in Holland at the beginning of the Second World War, so that we can make them here, the Humble EF50. So valve technology moved very, very quickly in this period. Broadcasting took off, 2LO, 1922, and it's interesting to me that next year is just about 100 years since broadcasting really took off in America. It took off massively from the beginning of 1922 to the end of 1922. It's a huge amount of broadcast. Here, 2LO started, I think it was in May 1922, so 100 years next year. The BBC company, not the corporation, that started towards the end of 1922, so that's 100 years next year. And it frightens me to think that I've held my call sign for half of that 100 years. In fact, a bit more than half, 52 years by next year. So I've held my call sign for more than half the history of the things that, we go back here to. This is some pretty much ancient history. HF and VHF, we were relegated to the rather useless shortwave bands, 200 meters and above. And of course, in 1922, transatlantic tests proved that probably Spark was coming to the end of its life. And for a few great years, we had pretty much a free reign in the HF spectrum until by 1927, we ended up in the amateur bands pretty much we know today. Actually, not 15 meters. That came a bit later, but the 80, 40, 20, 10 meters bands. So off-the-shelf ham radio gear in this country, excuse me, I've got a bit of a cough, was fairly limited, as we've seen a couple of slides, maybe not elsewhere in the world, but in this country, off-the-shelf ham radio gear was pretty limited. If you did operate in that period, then, and I have warned people, and I've never done it, that I'll actually dress in +4s to give this presentation once. That's Gerald Mark Hughes G2NM, but it's mostly home constructed here in the UK. The parts are available, but there was very little availability of off-the-shelf transmitters and receivers, regen receivers and simple receivers, but not a great deal when you look through the magazines at that time, mainly shortwave magazine. Different in America, as we'll see, but here, not a great deal of off-the-shelf gear at all. So here's an advert from Shortwave Mag from the 30s. That's actually just up the road from me. I know that road, Widmore Road, very well. It's in Bromley, not far from where I am here in Dartford in North Kent. And I grew up actually within a few miles of that. And this is a 1935, 36, 37 advert in Shortwave magazine. And many of you will look down that list and see the obvious connection between all of the radios on that list. And of course, the connection is, that's the Helicrafters Sky Buddy, and they're the RME 69. And many of you, of course, will spot the connection is that they're all American. And I'm not quite sure. I've never really got to the bottom of why we were so late coming to the party with sort of super het and good quality communications receivers in this country. There were even articles, if you search through in shortwave mags, asking where is the British high quality receiver. You could get regen receivers and simple 1 and 2 valves, and they were great, but not a top level communications receiver. I'm not sure if it was the price. £9 there for a Sky Buddy, it seems a little bit cheap, but 26, 30, 35, 38 pounds, that was quite a lot of money in the mid-30s for the average ham, and they would have probably been young hams. They were generally a lot of young men and teenagers, and they wouldn't have had access to that money unless they had parents who were able to put that amount of money up to buy their offspring, a decent communications receiver. So maybe we weren't preparing for the war either. I've not really got to the bottom of it. Eventually, Edison brought out their first proper sort of communications receiver called the ECR. And look at the price of it. This is pre-Second World War. It's it's £45. Now, you know, if 20 or 30 pounds was a lot of money, this is 1 or 2 months' salary probably back then. And certainly, you know, if you were at school or college or whatever, that's a lot of money. So there wasn't a great deal. And transmitters, there were a few if you look through the old shortwave maze, but not that many. But things were about to change, of course. And for many of us, and perhaps everybody on this call, the change that affected us because of the gear that came out of it was, of course, World War II. Radio had been used in World War I, even airborne, but World War II was the conflict that really brought technology and the progressive technology, particularly radio, to the fore, and things move very, very quickly. The world changed very, very quickly. Of course, all of the services had slightly different requirements for their comms. The Army and the Navy and the Air Force. And what happened, of course, in all the theatres of war is that the whole machinery of R&D and manufacture swung into operation at pretty much a breathtaking pace, not only the Allied powers, but the Axis powers as well. And the amount of gear and change that occurred, the amount of gear that was produced, and I've said this on every presentation, it still staggers me. Because my interest came at a period when all this stuff became available, is the amount of stuff and spares that were available were manufactured is absolutely incredible. And the result of the differing requirements between the services and what they could get their hands on was a diversity of equipment, the like of which we'll probably never see. It will never be the same. And this was, of course, HF radio gear, an awful lot of it. So the diversity and the production and the R&D through the wartime period was absolutely critical to a lot of our formative years in ham radio, which of course produced the 50s and the 60s, even into the 70s, a surplus explosion of gear, because it quickly, the amount of the development moved on so quickly that so much equipment became surplus to the requirements that it got onto the surplus market. And inevitably a word pops out, and I've tried to find the derivation of this word. You will all know what it is. I think you've already used it, of course. Boat anchor, and you'll know what that receiver is, and we'll talk about that in a minute. £100, more than £100. And I wonder where this phrase boat anchor actually came from for this presentation. So as I put this together through the lockdown, I had plenty of time to talk to my friends, email them, search the web, and what I found was this quotation from CQ magazine in 1956. If you know different, then tell me at the end. And it was a letter, apparently. I don't know if it's true that they had this letter, but they had this letter, supposedly, and they replied to this letter. And the letter was about converting wartime gear to amateur use in 1956. And the cutting reply in the magazine, which you can look up on the web, and the CQ magazines, a lot of them are archived, was this rather unkind response that you should anchor your boat with 1 inch manila, 100 feet of 1 inch manila line, tie one end around the radio. It does say small boat there, I think, doesn't it? Yeah, which is one of the small boat in my cartoon. So the term boat anchor appeared then, and of course it's lived with us ever since. But I think it's quite cutting, really. If that's a real letter, then they've replied and said, this article's coming up, but really rude about it. So that's where I think the term boat anchor came from. So all this kit started to appear, and some of it is in your shacks and some of it is in mine, and some people have no idea about it whatsoever. And I'll just cover, we've got quite a lot to get through, so I'll just dip into it a little bit here. But of course, from an army perspective, you can't really get away without talking about the 19 set, one of the most famous in our circles anyway, bits of wartime surplus radio kit. A few different marks, 1, 2, and 3, different powers, 2 to 9 watts, a huge numbers made and copied, now highly valued, used into the 50s, and with cadets, army cadets, certainly in my day, into the 70s. but just as we'll see in a couple of pictures time, they were just so available to us teenagers in the 60s, and fantastic bits of kit. No crystal control, 2 VFOs, which is another story about how crystals enable better accurate communication, but we haven't got time for that. And I think somebody already mentioned the 62 set, similar-ish to the untrained eye, lower power, 1 watt. Again, came onto the surplus market. And there's loads and loads and loads of these, and I'm sure you all know Ben G4BXC runs a military wireless museum, and just endless lists of them from around the world. But these I've just picked some that I particularly like. The 18 set, off converted 40 meters, 1/4 of a watt. And of course, the generic name for most of this kit is green radio, and it's become quite a big thing, even if it's not all green. As subsequent upgrades to military radios came along, Larkspur, Klansman, which I actually worked on because I worked in the MOD. I trained as an RF engineer for the Ministry of Defence in the 70s, so we had loads of Klansman gear to play with. I think it's Bowman now, and the next generation of this sort of green radio is Morpheus, which will probably be completely useless to radio hams in the way that I think Bowman is anyway, frequency hopping and secure. But in this period, there was so much of it available, and the price was just, compared to some of that stuff we looked at earlier, in the 30s, 30, 40, 50 quid for a receiver. Here we are in the mid 60s when you could get a 19 set for like £4.10. I know that's, 25, 30, 40 pounds now, but it's not in the league of those American receivers from the 30s. And you look through this advert, it's brilliant. You could get the power supply for it. You could get it unpacked, all sets and equipment are new and boxed. So it must have, some of this stuff must have been stored, well stored probably, all the waxy paper and stuff, and new in box. And what would it be now to get a 19 set new in a box? I mean, you wouldn't want to open it, would you? It's just the most amazing thing now. 19 sets and all their accessories fetch a huge amount of money. But for those of us on top band in the late 60s, pirating a little bit, 19 sets were the thing to have, and everybody seemed to have one in my schoolboy early ham radio days. And of course, green radio is a big thing now, and you get some people with all the Klansman and the Larkspur kit, all the variants of it, and it is green. There it is green, but that's a whole presentation in itself, isn't it? Big VMAs the VMAs have got some collectors who've just got rooms full of this stuff. But again, getting quite expensive now to buy. The Navy, they had some bits of kit that popped onto the market that some of us started to pick up and are now quite sought after. Probably the earliest from my my memory is a CR100 B28 receiver, quite a simple 2-pair receiver. Used in the Navy, not the best receiver in the world. Again, quite popular now, quite easy to repair, and for a while you could pick them up really cheaply. But they were superseded just after the war by this real boat anchor. I think it's £114, this one, the B40. A really good performer on AM and CW, and that's great, isn't it? We've got a bit of surplus gear, better than a cheap homemade receiver. Fantastic receiver, but what a real weight, £114 from 1949, but made by Murphy, and weight not an issue on a ship. If you look at any pictures of the Belfast radio room, sadly now with no radio hams in it because they've kicked out all their volunteers. I think their radio room's got 4 or 5 or 6 of them. I mean, that's just an incredible weight, but it doesn't matter, does it, on a battleship? And a few of my friends had those in their upstairs rooms, and I don't know what their parents thought. 1969, 70. What did they think one of those and the joists and everything. I just shuddered to think. I don't know how they got them up the stairs, some of them, but they did. And here's an advert for the thing. There it is, £114. Often in good condition, but much more expensive than your 19 set, £22. So again, you're delving into that, you know, mum and dad, can I have 22 quid, which is 1967, 68, bit of money to spend. And the thing about some of these real heavyweight radios, for me, is the weight of them, just taking them apart to do anything to them. But loads of my friends had them, and now there's one or two hams around the world. I think one in Holland who is just encyclopedic about the B40 HF receiver. So there we go. That's a bit more expensive. The Air Force, probably the most famous Air Force receiver in this country is the R1155, made under license by all sorts of different companies. Over 80,000 of them made from I can't remember what date I've got there because pictures are in the way. Yeah, 1947. But they popped onto the surplus market. It was a power supply included. I have had one. Had a DF option as well. But again, you could pick them up. I think somebody might have given me one when I was about 15. But now they tend to be, especially in halfway reasonable condition, quite valued. But for those of us who wanted an AM receiver, probably for only top band and 80 back in the day, any of this kit was just great. With its companion transmitter, the T1154, there it is, typical wartime bomber installation, not only Lancaster bombers, but others as well. And even just the coloured knobs now, fetch money on eBay. People collect all sorts of weird things now, don't they? Especially to these last 2 years of lockdown. Things have gone absolutely mad. and one or two of you on this, I don't know, people on this call or people in your club, Simon, they might have, they might come on with 1154, 1155. I know there are people who've got them as a complete station. The Americans, very popular with me. I always wanted one of these. My mate had one. I think his brother, who was a ham G3P station, he had one of these, G3PRT, here in Bromley. He had one of these, and I just thought it was such a cute little thing when I was like 14 or 15. Command radios, aircraft mainly in American aircraft, made by a number of different companies, normally specific to one band, which made them quite small. And ran off the aircraft supply, which meant that the power supply was that was not in the radio. And they've appeared over here, and I always wanted one. I've never owned a HF command set. And if you look here, this is a picture I took from an American website of I'm not sure if it's a B-17 or an American bomber, but you look at the amount of kit. This guy's got to deal with. All the command sets are there at the top, the transmitters and receivers. But he's got a Hallicraft as a receiver in front of him. But you look at what he's got, and I particularly like the, excuse my bad throw, I particularly like the Ford ashtray there on the left. And of course, all of you probably recognise the Collins ART-13 at the bottom, one of the earliest receivers with a resettable not a memory, but the thing where you could, a motorized arrangement, it would go back to a frequency that you preset. But you look at the amount of kit, no wonder he needed an ashtray. He must have been chain smoking so much kit. So what else? Well, other stuff started to pop out, listening stations and spies, and we didn't have as much homegrown high quality listening equipment as we needed at the beginning of the war. So and I think probably everybody in this call knows what happened. We went to the US under lease lend, any diplomatic arrangements to ship the gear over. And of course, one of the most several iconic radios is, for me, the granddaddy of them all, the AR-88. Made by RCA, grew out of earlier variants, the AR-77 and others, but just an absolutely staggering HF radio. and we put them into many of our listening stations, and there's loads of pictures, or maybe some of you have been to Bletchley, and the wire stations. There's one not far from where I used to live, gone after the war, that were filled up with AR-88s, and a lot of them became available, and it was the one that I wanted. I've had two of them. I had one early on, my top band DXing days on CW, with a crystal phasing control, and I could hear the electrons bouncing off the aerial. I used to think of working W1BB and W1HGT on top band CW. Just loved it. I wanted one, and when I got it, didn't disappoint. I have another one now, so I got rid of that one. Silly, stupidly, I got rid of that one in the 70s when I just thought it was too big and not modern, and I got rid of it. But absolutely phenomenal receiver, just spinning the dial and the backlash gearing arrangement, just heaven. And I like to put the odd film link in my presentations, and here is one that I spotted quite by accident because of my musical stuff I do in music, where I was looking at the Beatles film Help for some reason. I'm learning something for somebody. And there's an AR-88 with Roy Kinnear, George Harrison in front of it, and Paul McCartney. And I fell about laughing, and my wife came and said, "What are you laughing at?" She didn't really understand. There's an AR-88 in Help. So I do like the odd little film clip. And you can buy them brand new in a box up to about 1969, 1970. The prices varied a bit. 75 to 87 pounds or guineas, but look at the price. Now you're not talking about mum and dad, can I have a bit of money for a receiver? 75 quid was a lot of money back in the late 60s. And I do know my friend Dave, G4AKY, now GW4AKY, in fact. I think he's got 5 or 6 of them. He bought one of these in Lyle Street and brought it back. I don't know, he was in Croydon. I don't know how we got it back on the train. He's a big lad, but I mean, this is a 100 weight radio, you know, probably in some packing. But what a great receiver. And of course, they're still popping up all over eBay and hundreds of pounds now. I got my one for next door to nothing. The HRO, of course, can't go without saying the HRO. Fantastic receiver, plug-in dials for whatever band you wanted. You could have plug-in band spread dials as well for the ham bands. There were a number of options to get around having too many plug-in coils, rather, but inevitably you did need a lot of plug-in coils. I actually have a National NC 100X, which looks like an HRO but isn't, and has got all the coils built in for ham bands. Well, the ham bands that were around in 1937 in America, which excluded 15 meters. And this coils switched under the radio by rack and pinion coil pack, which moves up and down. Incredible bit of engineering. But it looks like an HRO because it's got the same dial, but it's band spread for the ham bands, and works a treat. It sounds fantastic on AM, and got a crystal filter as well. Just amazing. For me, if I'd have had one, it would have blown away any of the sort of stuff I could have built or got hold of, any of the imported Japanese radios. It's just incredible. I've got it down my workshop at the moment, works a treat. And again, we bought in loads of them from the US, loads and loads of them. And there it is, the coil pack per bound. So after the war, other bits of kit were started to appear, which subsequently became available to some of us. And one of the most famous for me, which I haven't owned, although I know plenty of people who have, is this baby, the Rakel RE17. And of course, many of you will know about it. Maybe you own one or two of them. Rakel, which is Ray and Cal, that's where it comes from. In the early 50s, they, I'm not sure how they ended up with a contract to supply a British-made high-grade communications receiver to the government. But somewhere along the line, they had an idea that they would be able to subcontract or build under license Collins receivers. But I think, so the story goes, Collins came over to the West London office and saw what was probably a fairly small operation and thought, it's not good enough to build Collins. you know, assemble Collins parts and rebadge it. And I believe, if you believe anything you read on the internet, that the Collins also wanted to use a lot of American components, and that wouldn't have gone down very well with the government at the time. So Rakel turned to Trevor Wadley of the Barlow-Wadley loop fame, and there it is with its long slide rule dial, and a very complicated mechanical beast it is too. But they turned to Trevor Wadley of the Barlow-Wadley loop and came up with a topology which some of you will probably know about, it popped out later in radios like the FRG7, and constructed this valve receiver using this topology, and was very successful and got Rakel off the ground in a big way as a defence contractor, popular with government. Lots of them came on the ham market afterwards. Quite a difficult radio to work on because it's not familiar to anybody who likes working with superhets. It's not quite the same, and quite a complicated mechanical construction. Again, it's a heavyweight bit of kit. But nevertheless, classic radio, and one or two of my friends have got these and have restored them as well, and swear by them on AM, CW and SSB. I don't think the early ones had a product detector. And there's another film clip with loads of RA-17s in it. But you probably know, although some people I show this to don't know, it's not real. They're not real RA-17s. Well, they are, but it's only the front panel of RA-17s from Dr. No, the first James Bond film. If any of you have watched it, there's a clip, there's a scene where they're in a listening station here in the UK, and apparently it's just the front panel. They bought these surplus HROs, which by the mid-60s were superseded, and cut the chassis off. You know, to us now is absolute sacrilege, but there you go. There's some RA-17, and you still see them actually. I've watched the odd film, and I'm terrible for this. My wife goes mad because I watched the film and I recognise a bit of kit. You'd be surprised. And even some more recent films, and I think there's one in Goldfinger as well, where James Bond's going to get cut in half by the laser. I think as the camera pans around, there's an RA-17 in Goldfinger's control room. So there you go. So surplus gear, loads of it, loads and loads of it, and we love it, and we've worked on it, and we're still using it today. Things started to change in the 40s. There wasn't much homemade ham radio, home constructed, manufactured ham radio gear here. That's why a lot of us bought this kit, because it was great quality and it was relatively cheap, but it was, the quality was a thing, wasn't it? You got an AR-88D, well, you got a fabulous bit of kit. Things started to change as we moved after the war. Collins had been making ham radio kit before the war for their domestic market. I don't think much of it made it over here. I can't find many adverts about it. There he is, Art Collins W0CXX. And after the war, some of his incredible, he was an incredible wartime contractor. Collins was a staggering supplier to the military in the US. But after the war, that work started to fall away as we came out of the war into, I don't think it was a recession in America, but they didn't need it anymore. They didn't need the amount of kit for a while anyway, certainly straight after the war. So he switched back to starting to manufacture ham radio gear initially, of course, AM gear, and I think you've already mentioned some of it before. So this is a 75A1, which is 1947. For the DX Hound, that's what it says in the adverts, AM. And not much of this, I don't think, in the 40s came over here. But of course it was super duper dear, very high quality. He started to use the Permeability tuned oscillator, which I think you probably, many of you know about, the coil with a slug that moves up and down inside it, driven by a gearing arrangement that moves much more linear, or easier to make more linear than the VFO, and more stable. And Collins, I'm not sure if they invented the PTO, but they certainly popularized it, and they carried on using it. And one or two other manufacturers pick up on the PTO as well, which made it very, very stable, very accurate readout. not many in the UK, and expensive here. However, Art Collins started to look at SSB, and many of you will know the story that he demonstrated SSB to the American military Strategic Air Command, Curtis LeMay. And Curtis LeMay was very impressed that SSB, with modern stable gear and its advantages in bandwidth and signal to noise over distance over AM, was something the military should pick up on. And Collins immediately saw this as another great business opportunity for the military market, and pretty much by 1955 embraced SSB as the future. And then really started, and now we move out, some of the AM stuff that you guys have been talking about has started not only supplied to the military, but realized that SSB was probably going to be the future of HF communications across the world, so, and ham radio included. And this guy, GW0ROW, had this idea. Apparently he worked for Collins, and he looked at the their top lineup, and many of you will know these as the Gold Dust Twins, KW 75A4 on the left. Somebody just mentioned one earlier, and the KWS one on the right. Now that's the KWS one there on the right. That's just the RF deck. Some of you may know the power supply is in a cabinet, 5-6 feet high, the power supply in it. And the KWS-1 was reviewed in Shortwave magazine as a transmitter in 1957, I think it was. And it was £950 imported from the US. I think they're a bit embarrassed about reviewing it, because how many, young man hams just, in the 50s could afford £1,000 for a transmitter, but that's what it was. And if you look up a 1957 Shortwave mag, you'll find the review in there of this, thing made almost no object to get a quality bit of kit. But Gene had this brilliant idea. He looked at these two bits of kit, and he saw they both had a PTO in them, and he saw that they both had a carrier oscillator in them of some description, and he saw that they both had a band crystal oscillator in them to set the band. And he got to thinking, probably not the first person to think of it, but why do I need two of those? Why can't I just have one of that and squeeze everything into one box? And he went to Art Collins, and Art Collins saw the thinking and agreed that they could come up with something pretty revolutionary. And of course they did. And here it is. It's one of the first SSB transceivers made. The KWM1, I think there's one in the wireless, in the radio center at Bletchley Park. And there's a ham band version of it there. Nothing below 20 meters, I don't think. But a transceiver, now you've got one knob to turn, SSB, and it's a radical change from having loads of huge boxes, which we like, of course, loads of boxes, don't we? But this was I'd call it a game changer, and I think it probably was. But on SSB. Now, you can even use it mobile, Collins said. I'm not sure you could get it into a Ford Anglia at the time, or a Ford Popular, but hey, they said you could use it mobile, and there's a DC power supply for it. Now, I don't know if the next picture is true or not, or whether I believe everything I read off the internet, but supposedly there was one on Gary Powers' spy plane on a secret CIA frequency when it was shot down in 1960. I don't know. Nobody else is going to tell me, but the internet. And is that true or not? I don't know. But it's a good little story. It made me smile when I found it, so I had to stick it in this presentation. Collins quickly realised they could really make the KW1 a little bit better and sexier than. For both the military and for ham radio use. And of course, what did they come out with? The KWM2/2A SSB transceiver. Now, I know it's not one of the S-line, but we've got a few pictures of the S-line coming up, but it looks like an S-line, and it fits into the Collins S-line physical sort of layout. A fantastic bit of kit. I have offers on two, and I'm still trying to get to a KWM M2, but they set the standard of the wraparound case and a fairly nice look. For me, it's a classic look. I can't look at it without, it's in sort of my DNA of looks of radios. Maybe anybody who's never seen one of these who looks one of the first time doesn't see it like me, and maybe some of us, but it just looks fantastic, the proportions. And fantastic bit of kit from 1959 to 1985, a very long production run, 30,000 of them made. That I had pretty much a benchmark for SSB transceivers, professional quality, military and amateur use, but expensive. If any of you in the 60s went to Radio Shack, was it in Northwest in Hampstead? If anybody remembers, I had their adverts in Shortwave Mag. You know, the Collins kit was there, and it was the top line for a lot of hams with a bit of money in the UK to have a Collins setup. But it became a whole range of gear, which they christened the S line. That's the interior of KWM2. And the S line expanded into just about the whole thing, the whole line of station controllers, the power supply, the receivers, the transmitters, it's a speaker. So it became this all tabletop station for SSB, where you the technology of SSB meant that you could shrink down the power supply because of the way the duty cycle of SSB, we all understand that. But gradually you could shrink everything down and make this super sexy looking gear, which maybe would look out of place on a nice table in the corner of a room in your house. Maybe not so much in the UK, but you can imagine it in the US. But fantastic gear, desirable now, highly collectible. The big issue for me with any Collins gear and any parts of it required is the cost. Absolutely the big drawback for it. All of this gear's got drawbacks, be it the weight, be it the technology, be it components. For Collins gear, for me, it's the cost. Even a knob or an escutcheon or part of a wafer switch assembly seems to fetch just absolutely premium prices. Which is why I don't have any Collins kit here. I probably will end up with a KWM2 at some point in the next year, or now COVID's gone and I can go and look at the guys who have offered me them, but it's got to be at the right price. It's expensive. A lot of it's 115 volts, which is not necessarily a problem. I think quite a lot ended up in Germany with the US Armed Forces, which means it's still 115 volts. But fantastic stuff. And here's a film clip. Here's Doris Day in a film called The Glass Bottom Boat, which is a bit of a spy spoof. And she's got some Collins gear there. And when I saw it, I fell about laughing, and managed to find and stop frame it on the computer and cut the clip out. I think one of the production crew or her stage husband was a radio ham. Company now close to my heart, Robert Drake, WHCYE. Robert Drake's company was a small-time contractor to the military after the Second World War, but it really, as with Collins and others, the lack of work meant he ended up scraping around, subcontracting, but he was a radio ham, and he saw that, again, there was a burgeoning market for ham radio gear, and he also saw, just after Collins, that it was going to be SSB. That's what he, of course, he was right. So he came up with a few innovative designs for receivers. And a couple of times, I think, or more than once, he offered his designs to the other manufacturers of the day, like Hallicrafters and others. But they weren't interested. And really, it came down to it that Drake was going to build any of his designs, then he was going to have to do it himself. And the Drake and radio company the Drake company started, along with other stuff, it started making ham radio gear. So build it with your own companies. His initial receiver was the Drake 1A SSB receiver. Here it is. I saw one at Friedrichshafen my years ago and all mixed up. So not 2019 Friedrichshafen, and I think the guy wanted 700 or 800 euros for it, so I didn't buy it. It looks like it's been put on its side. They call it American mailbox styling. And they sold quite well. He wasn't sure, but a couple of go-ahead suppliers in the US said, you make them, Robert, and we'll try and sell them. So we'll buy them off of you. So he started making ham radio kit, and he carried on doing it. And started to update from the 1 line to the 2 line to the 4 line. For me, the classic Drake gear that I've been able to afford and buy over the last 20 odd years is the 4 line, and I've got a lot of it. The classic transceiver in the 4 line is the Drake TR4C from 1963. Sweep tubes, as many of you will know about, because they were dead cheap, 10 or 20 cents, I think they were, in talking to my friends in the US who know about Drake, ridiculously cheap compared to transmitting valves, TV line output tubes, and of course they work at HF. And the duty cycle meant that you could get quite a lot of peak power out of them. There's 3 in the transceivers, so you can get over 200 watts PEP with a proper peak hole wattmeter. You can see it, 200 watts PEP. But quite light because there's no power supply built in. That's what I like, means you can turn it over and take the bottom off in a jiffy. Quite compact, so a little bit crowded inside. Got a PTO, so very stable. And I love the styling. For me, it's just that sexy look again, and I love them. And I've got 4 TR4s of all the variants from 63 to 77. So sweep tubes gave me the power, and a little bit more expensive over here, but cheaper than Collins, but still expensive in the UK, and they caught on quickly in the US. But they got a lot of power out of them, proved to be pretty reliable, and attracted some celebrity, if that's the right word, customers. This is my and they moved to make separates as well, separate transmitters and receivers, and probably everybody on this call knows that the B line and the C line are for BT4X, but there's an A line as well, part of an A line, but the B line was classic. That's my B line on my dining room table. I also have a complete C line, separate transmitter receiver, and I've got 4 of the transceivers from the earliest to the end. There was a very early TR3, which is slightly different output valves, but I've got the later 63 onwards variants, so I've got a lot of that gear. So I was able to pick it up cheaply, maybe not anymore. And there's a celebrity there, is King Hussein JY1, who some of you may have worked. I don't know. My friend Laurie, G3UML, quite a lot of conversations with King Hussein, and even met him when he came to London. But there he is with the Drake 4 line. He moved on to the transistor 7 line, and there's pictures of him with that. But here in this picture, he's got the Drake 4 line. Drake unfortunately rested on their reputation a bit too long with valve transceivers. Still making valve transceivers in 1977, good as they were, was a bit out of date. They rested, and that's been as a theme through a few of these later slides, really. So they went out. Drake went out of business for ham radio gear in the 80s, after the Drake 7 line started. Probably didn't sell that well, or Robert Drake died as well. Now we come to my something very close to my heart, KW. Close to my heart because I live very close to the factory, and because I had a friend very nearby. I didn't live here then, and I used to go there with him when I got G3 ZPS. I was only 16, so I was a schoolboy, and they were very good to me. Rowley Shears, here he is, G8KW, and his team. They liked us kids, and they never threw us out of the showroom here in Dartford. Only if somebody came in with wads of cash, which on Saturday morning when we went there, loads of hands came in with wads of cash to buy their gear. So, but they were very good to us, and I'm still close to a few of the employees and the ex-employees. And there is Ken Ellis, G5KW, dressed rather strangely, and they formed the KW company really because they both had call signs with KW in it. There's no kilowatt or anything else involved. It's fairly simple. After the war, and Rowley's got a very interesting wartime career, which I haven't got time to talk about, but I know about it because I know his cousin, and we've had a lot of conversations and documentation about Rowley's career in the war, which we haven't got time to talk about, and I haven't got a presentation about it. It's just fascinating. But after the war, in Germany in the 40s, he managed to get the DARC and the ham radio up and running again. because there was so much clandestine operation after the war that he formalised it and helped bring the DARC into being. And there he is. And when I'm in Friedrichshafen, I talk to them about it. And the older hams do know that he was DARC member number 1. Canellis is dressed rather strangely because he did some work for the Saudi, fairly fledgling new Saudi Arabian royal family in 1950, which I don't have time to talk about, but rather clever comms stuff when one of their royal family was ill. And they awarded him the Royal Rose and Dagger. Some of you may remember that Ken was a big operator on 6 meters. But they formed this company, KW Electronics. And after a few fits and starts, they started making gear. Some of it was in kit form, some of it not. From a house just up the road that I drove by at 4:30 this afternoon here in Wilmington, not far from me. And I often drive past and tip my hat to Rowley's initial premises. They started making gear in pretty much the boat tanker style, and they stuck with AM initially. That's KW 77 receiver there on the right. I've got 2 of those, KW Vanguard on the left. AM gear in the boat tanker style. They bought in some of the bits from Italy. In fact, I think they copied loads of stuff from Geloso. It does look very, very similar, doesn't it? When you look at some of the circuits, you know, I wonder if there was quite a lot of borrowing, from want of a better word, going on. Well, there was later on. We haven't got time to talk about it, but they borrowed, almost wholesale copied. KW Viceroy SSB transmitter. I've got a beautiful one of these. It's big enough to put another SSB transmitter inside. There's so much room inside it. Boat anchor design. But they had a little think around 1962 and decided that after Collins, they should make SSB gear. So they came up with this great idea: get a KWM2 design and copy it, and then make it cheap in a shed down here in Dartford. And that's exactly what they did. They came up with a cut price KWM2. And it really is like a KWM2. It's got the same basic architecture, 455 kilohertz, broadband, 200 kilohertz, first IF, 455 kilohertz at the end, mechanical filter, like Collins. But everything else about it hasn't got PTO, it's got a capacitor VFO, but everything else about it is cut down. Everything is cut down. The front end, the tuning arrangements, everything is cut right down to the absolute minimum so they can make this thing cheap. And this is an actual prototype. The photographer down the road, 1963, very close topology to a KWM2, but dead cheap. No CW, no AM, sorry guys. Very poor dial readout, only 2 kilohertz. Got one here, right here by me. And this mechanical filter, which we'll just cover in a couple of slides' time. Made by Kokusai in Japan, presumably much cheaper than getting Collins ones. But 455 kilohertz, again, 2 carrier crystals. So they got the whole thing cut down in price. Top band on it. But the thing is, they got it down to a price that was cheaper than Collins, way cheaper, and cheaper than Drake, and looked sexier than quite a lot of other kit that was coming out of smaller manufacturers here in the UK, which made it a winner. And they called it the G-Line. And they made it look a bit later variants look a bit, or should I say a lot like Collins. And here's my KW2000B on my kitchen table. The same wraparound style, same colours almost, the grey, 2-tone grey with the bezel, very Collins-like. There's S-line Collins, G-line, KW, Rowley and the guys, they knew, you know, what they could get away with. and KW2000A, B and E, I have them all the variants and all the separates that they brought out, just like Collins, they brought out separates. And I have just about the lot here. I picked them up over the years because they're easy to repair for me. The parts are all readily available, no sweep tubes in them, just the filter. Good performance, nice styling, 6146 is, had 160 meters and RIT. So, you know, they drifted a bit, so you needed it. As anybody who heard me on 40 meters yesterday, probably attest to. But best of all, so much cheaper than US gear, made a mile from me. And that's the factory there. I used to go as a kid. You just see the little sign down that alleyway, and you can see the antennas on the roof there. Rowley's office is still there. That building is all still there. The works is just behind there. And any of you that read the shortwave mags will have seen all the adverts, and I've got all the gear on that page. I've got the linears, the Vesper, the receivers. They're all innovative and funny little ways and funny dial arrangements, but great gear for the time. The big drawback, as with other gear, everybody's got a drawback. If you're going to repair it, the drawback is the mechanical filter. The Cocker's filters are filled with foam, and the foam degrades over time. And when you take them apart, the mechanical element, which has got a transducer at each end, has got this degraded foam in, and you have to take it apart. And it's not radio engineering, is it? It's craft engineering. You've got to dissolve it in meths. You've got to try not to damage the transducers or the wiring, because quite often the wires are broken, because if you shake the filter without the foam in it, the element bangs up and down inside, and the performance and the pass band and the attenuation is all degraded. But it can be brought back to life, and I've done a few. Worst case, you put a Murata in there, which is a not popular fix, but it does get your radio back on the air. But getting 455 kilohertz crystals is quite hard as well. There's a way around everything, as you guys all know. And of course, Rowley did use some of the cheapest nasty Hunts capacitors. We operate Cray Valley Club, a GB8 KW, a special event every January. We're doing it this January, the 8th and 9th. Celebrating KW in our Scout Hall. We have all the antennas and everything. We've got a lovely club shack. And that is Rowley Shears' son, Richard, who we're in contact with regularly. He's a friend of our club. And there he is. He might be using one of my radios. And there's an Static D104. Belongs to Guy G0UKN. And we run that. We're going to be running it this year at 8th and 9th. And we'll run AM and SSB, all KW gear. And Guy's going to try and dress up and have everything like 1950. I've even got a prop here for him. I can't find it now. But oh yeah, I've even got this prop specially for him. And if anybody's got a coat with leather elbows, can I have it, please? Because he wants to look just like he's out of 1957 shortwave magazine. So there's KW, and of course, can't miss some of these. Kodar and Eddystone, fantastic receivers, British made. By now they've got their act together. Some of them are don't have a mains transformer in. They're a live chassis, so you've got to watch out when you're repairing them. But there's a whole collector community of these now. Eddystone receivers, some of you probably had them, some of you may still own them. The fabulous slide rule dial used in KW Viceroy and others. So I've got some Eddystone. I've got an Eddystone receiver here. Well-built stuff. Watch out for the live chassis though. And that's one of the classic ones, the 840C. And a little one here, which is quite popular in 2-meter operators, because you could use it as a 2-meter IF AM, just tune up and down quickly and take it out portable. And here we are, another film clip, KW Vanguard on the left, Eddystone receiver on the right. Yes, it's Dr. No again, the very beginning of the film, where the operator is in Jamaica. I think it's in Jamaica, when she calls London and then gets shot. Kodar, I've got several Kodar stations. If you're looking at this on a big monitor, the transmitter is smaller than the picture you're looking at right now. Kodar 85. Rowley never quite cracked the mobile market. He made some great little bits of gear, but he didn't in a way that Kodar did. Not particularly well-made transmitter, but highly collectible now. People love them. I've got a couple of them. I've been on VMARS and worked with the guys on them. Sometimes I put them into a linear. That's quite fun. Stick the 8 watts into a linear and get like 80 watts of AM out of it. Big in the 60s, very, very big in the 60s. Had a companion receiver, which is awful, the T28. But very popular now on top band, and you can use them on 80. Where it doubles in the buffer, but you've got to be careful that you're not on both bands at the same time. So the PA in these, and all of them is the same for both bands. There's a mod for that. The kit revolution came along for all sorts of ham radio kit, and of course you can't really move very far without mentioning Heathkit. We've already mentioned it this evening. And Heathkit made absolutely everything, and they had their claim to fame that their kits would always work. That's the Benton Harbor in America. facility, absolutely enormous. They make kits for everything. If you get a 60s, 70s Heathkit catalogue, everything, TVs and hi-fi, music, test gear, just staggering, computers, just staggering educational stuff, staggering company. And I think we already mentioned earlier on that there's a difference between ones made here and assembled, the kits put together here in the UK with a U and a B and other suffixes in the US. But they got into ham radio, AM, we've already mentioned the DX100, DX40, and one or two other bits of kit. They got into ham radio pretty quickly in the 50s, AM and SSB, great value. There's your DX100. There's a VMARS net of DX100s. They got into SSB with what was called the poor man's Collins. There it is, SB102, that's mine. Again, it's got the wraparound case. Everybody adopted the same basic layout. And again, a whole line, linears and tuners and SWR bridges and microphones rebadged, but all with Heathkit. HW101, I've got 3 of those, I think, and the earlier 100. Very easy to work on. You're fighting when you restore this gear between a basic design and somebody who built it who isn't you, who might not be very good at soldering. But the thing about Heathkit gear I love is the manuals. And I know every nut and bolt is mentioned in the manual. I know idiots, and maybe some of you do, who get the Heathkit manual, get the radio, start at the back, not at the front, and take it apart. So when they get to the beginning, they've got the radio completely in parts, every nut and bolt and every solder removed, every bit of PCB, and then they go forward again and rebuild the radio with new capacitors, probably resistors. The resistors in these radios are absolutely bloody awful. The ones in the UK anyway, they drift way off high. And then they've got a new radio again. They've got it as it would have been back in the day, and they've built it. Madness, isn't it? Well, a quick pause for thought while we run for the last 10 minutes or so of this. There's quite a lot of gear there that I haven't spoken about. Some's probably dear to your heart, but I haven't been able to cover it. In the swinging 60s, I've left out Swan, Hamelin, Tom Withers, who I knew personally, Hallicrafters. But things started to change for us hams around 1970, of course, driven by, of course, the big Japanese names who started to appear. There's Sarco, JA1MP, and in many ways, Sarco's vision was no different to Robert Drake to make domestic ham radio kit and Rowley Shears to make domestic ham radio kit for the UK. No real difference initially. So he started making that radio kit for Japan. But then he had a bigger vision, and that bigger vision was, I can sell it around the world. And with help from the Japanese government, who really wanted to get a push for industry and technology, he forged ahead where others didn't. Drake and KW just weren't able to acquire the funding and the expertise and the development in a way that Sarco and others. There we are from 1959, the company started small, but rapidly grew, very quickly grew, in fact. And like the S line and the G line and the KW line, he came up with a name as well, a couple of letters, must have been all the rage. It still is, isn't it? And he came up with Fox Tango FT. The Americans call it Fox Tango. And of course, it's in our DNA, isn't it? Fox Tango. We just mentioned FT gear earlier in the presentation. I've got loads of it, so I love it. The classic earlier gear, and he innovated very quickly, and quickly ramped up production capability. And waiting in the wings, of course, were the other Japanese greats, Trio, which became Kenwood, and Icon, which came out of a company called Inui. Some of you might remember, and they all started to ramp up their development and the production capability to globally supply good quality ham radio gear, amongst everything else electronic, of course, as we know, but it's talking about ham radio. And for Sarco, probably the thing that most of us remember is the FT101. I've got earlier versions of this, pre the FT101 and the earlier stuff, but the FT101 really epitomised the way things had changed. Drake still making all their valve gear, no RIT. KW is still making all their valve gear, KW 2000B, still selling well. Yaesu come along, FT101, don't need any extras, got RIT, AC and DC power supplies built in, sweep tube, so loads of power, stable, well made, one box. All you need is a mains lead and an aerial, and you're on the air. You plug a mic in, nothing else required. And the price as well. Then they managed to start selling it around the world. Well made. Nothing more to add. They even added a speech processor later on, so there really wasn't anything else. And the Americans, certainly in their advertising, you could put it on the overhead luggage of a plane, take it out, you got to take it with you. In fact, not a lot of radios now are completely built in, are they, with power supply, 12 volts. Everything built in, good quality parts. Fox Tango, the Fox Tango Club was formed and started to feed back to Sarko and his team. Some of the early FT101s weren't very good on receive, not very good on transmit. But they put top band on when it was required. They fixed the receiver and the transmit problems, spurious problems, and they made just a gargantuan amount. I don't even know what the true number is. Is it 100,000, 200,000, 300,000? The number is staggering. It exceeded the Drake and the KW. Just a completely different ballpark. And there's not a lot of pictures from that period, but when you do see the odd picture, this is their production facility, probably around the same time as KW around, just down the road from it. I can tell you, their little sheds and industrial units did not look like this. Just disappears into the distance, doesn't it? So they really aim to get going, and it just carried on, of course. So the big three became to dominate. FT101 changed to 101ZD. I've got 3 of those, I think, and not quite as easy to repair as the earlier ones, but I can repair them very quickly. Most of them pretty good, and now highly desirable. They go for £300 or £400 now, don't they? Yaesu made the earlier all simple, almost CB like FT200. I've got 2 of them. I love them. They work great, quite stable enough for me to rate you on 40 meters with them. A couple of sweep tubes. Trio Kenwood brought out some iconic radios, and I'm just going to quickly gloss over a few as we run to the end of this. TS830 is absolutely one of their legendary bits of gear, and you find them now fetching quite a lot of money. Very well made. This blew the competition away, and their cut price TS520. So we spoke about the FT901 earlier, FT902. I've got an FT902. I've had it for years. It's my workhorse radio for years and years. And there was a telling advert in the 1978 shortwave magazine on Radcom. Yaesu are advertising this radio, the 901, became the 902 with walk bands in 1979. Everything in the kitchen sink built in, power supply, tune-up time, a Kia, noise blanker, AM proper FM filtered, proper AM filter. So all filters, CW notch filter, RIT, all in one box. Drake still selling a Drake TR4 valve transceiver that needed a power supply, didn't have any of those facilities. And finally, they deigned to put RIT on it. In 1977-78, I've got one of those last production Drake. It doesn't compare. The Drake is two generations of design behind, and it shows how they came to dominate and now do dominate greatly. ICOM chose, after a brief dalliance with valves, to go completely solid state. I don't really like the ICOM solid state gear from this period because they made it so small that it's almost impossible to repair. Everything in the PLL module is a sealed box on top of another module. I've had a few in and looked at them, but I don't really want to touch them. Some of them are just so difficult to repair. So they eschewed valves completely and went fully transistorized. And of course, the IC number, their number, like Fox Tango, the IC numbering retains today. So rigs got small, maybe. I think some of them now, like the new Yaesu, are pretty big and heavy, but pretty much the bow tankers disappeared in many shacks, except those of us who still love them. So why do we do any of this stuff? Well, I don't know. It's memory lane for me. I don't know what it is for you guys. Is that me listening to the radio? Well, it isn't me actually, but you know what I mean. Lusting after it. I think there's a period in a lot of people's lives when they're kids, like 15, where it's formative. Everything is like the newest thing and you want to absorb everything. And I could read those magazines like Shortwave Mag and recite them. You know, I took it all in. And when I got older, I go back to that time because it's a sort of formative, your music, the gear, your hobbies, that's what you're going to be. And that's what it is for me. So it is memory lane. You know, I dreamed then that I'd have a Fender Stratocaster and play the guitar. I've got about 4 of them and I've played the guitar for 50 years. I'm still a gigging musician. I wanted a red sports car. I've got a red sports car now, it's not a Ferrari. And I wanted to play all the Beatles songs. I can pretty much play them all now, but I couldn't then. But that was, you know, it was all in my DNA at that point. And I wanted a Drake TR4, but I couldn't have one. It was going to be a radio ham. Hundreds of pounds, no way. Homemade top band transmitter, an AR88D for me. And, you know, we had these magazines. I just lapped them up. And there's the Drake advert. It's 225 quid for a Drake transmitter, but you could get a complete KW transceiver for that. So that's where KW won out, you know, in that period, that late 60s period. And I could go up to London, not very many pictures of the London shops. They're all around the country. The surplus shops where you could go and buy crystals and valves and bits and buy a 19 Stereo AGA and all manner of other surplus kit. And it was like fairy wonderland, you know, for me, and loads of young men, and it was mainly young men. So, you know, what do I need? That's part of my workshop. It's supposed to be music workshops, full up with ham radio gear. Well, for HF, you don't need a great deal. I can test the receiver pretty much with an aerial to get a view of whether it's working properly on HF. Does the noise go up on 10 meters with a well-matched aerial, then it's okay. The receiver's sensitive enough. It takes time and commitment and a willingness, doesn't it, to research and learn. And if you haven't got those, you have to sort of put a bit of time in. It comes down to those 3 things for me. And it's like decorating your house, restoring an old car. It's time, it's commitment to do it. And it's that willingness to learn if you want to do something that you haven't done before. And you don't do it all at once. You don't suddenly learn how to do it. I didn't suddenly. I could restore radios much quicker than I could 20 years ago. And you need Elmers, American term, I know, clubs, and you need friends. You need people who phone up and talk to you about. Clubs are great. You know, you need to research online. Some people hate forums, and they're awful, some of them. But I use them. I filter them, and I use the internet all the time because of it's a resource and all the manuals. You know, eBay, well, I don't like eBay. Things have got really expensive on eBay. I prefer my network of friends, but they're pretty much drying up now, and I prefer rallies. Are we going to have any more? 2 years next year without a rally, but I love going to rallies and you know, not knocking people down, but you know, if there's something there, a bit of KW gear, and I think it's a reasonable price, we'll do a deal and I'll buy it. And I've done that, and I've got the gear working within a few weeks. But it comes down to the price, how much you're prepared to pay. Sadly, everything collectible has gone up in the last 2 years. Unless you can tell me it hasn't. Cars, my car's worth more money. My cameras have got suddenly cheap 35 mil. They've all gone up. Ham radio kit, you know, it's just ridiculous. So yeah, these mechanical things will all be a problem in old gear. Switches, relays, and pots. I clean them and take them out before I even ever turn anything on. Resistors in some gear ridiculously go high, and some nasty capacitors I always change, and others I don't. Those hunts, they're horrible. And electrolytics, that's a presentation in itself. Some of you will have views. I change critical ones and lower value ones, not all of them all the time, but power supply I generally do, because the chance of failure is so destructive and messy. And these things seem to go on forever, and these things don't. Valves don't. I don't have many valve failures. I've had quite a few solid state failures, so they're not immune to failure. They've got an unlimited life. These things, well, I wouldn't even go near them to repair a modern radio, LSI. It's board repair, isn't it, or module repair. And I love repainting things. I repaint all my KW gear in nearly period correct colours. I've learned how to do it. I was crap to start with. And there's a KW 2000 that I fully restored, except for the front panel, which I always find difficult. One of many that I've got, and repainted and refurbished, changed resistors and loads of caps. But it's standard safety, isn't it? Quite loads of people are dead frightened of valves and the high voltages. And you know, we go to some places and they're trying to even pick them up. I think they're going to die just for picking up a valve, and it's fine, but it's double check, isn't it? We only get one chance, those of us that play with 2, 3, 4, 5, 600, 900, or right up to 2 or 3 kV in linears. So we only get one chance to get it wrong, and then we might be dead. So as I've said on my presentations, if you're going to do anything, safety is absolutely key to it. So the pitfalls for me, the big pitfall is the bodger, things that have been done to something before I got it. And annoyingly, a lot of radio hands who weren't professional engineers thought they were, and start soldering, spraying and drilling holes. And of course, nothing's documented, is it, when you get something which has been bodged? That was in an FT101ZD that I got from my local radio club. You're right, it's a Boots or whatever transistor radio, 455 kilohertz, part of a domestic transistor radio in there. I won't tell you what it did, but I stripped the whole lot out. But what a bodge. And luckily I had another FT101ZD to compare. And that's in the bottom of the Swan radio. What was the guy? I think it's G3W. What he couldn't even, what's that relay doing? Something to do with CW braking. It took me days to retrace the circuit diagram and remove all this horrid. I'd just like to remove all bodges. So that's pretty much what the end of the presentation. What do we get out of it? Some of us, well, is it fun? I think it's fun. Other people would say you've got a very strange view of what fun is. You know, playing with this gear and fettling it and using it and annoying other hands when it drifts. But for me, it's been a challenge because I want to learn how the people thought at the time. It's an achievement because I've done something that I couldn't do. And I've learned the skill of, you know, like fixing a filter or going through a circuit diagram and understanding how the designer intended it to work and repairing it. I love it. It's madness, really. And the reality is, you know, for those of us that use whole valve gear, SSB, AM, CW, they haven't changed, have they? For, you know, half a century or more. CW haven't changed for 100 years. And they work when you operate on AM, and I operate on AM. Works as well now. Nobody, and the SSB gear, it works as well now. And the CW gear, when I was on top band, it works as well as any other gear, if not better than the gear around at the time. So to me, it's absolutely fine. I laugh when they say that modern gear is all modes, because it doesn't do all the computer modes. You need a computer for that. So these modes haven't changed and actually work quite well. There's no hidden menus. And I like the social history of, it's about my social history of the people who built them, who designed them, who worked on them. I've met many of them from KW. I've met the people who bent the vanes on a KW VFO. So, and it's fun for me. It's a link with my past, and maybe that's what it is. And it's a bit like driving an old car, isn't it? This is the last picture. It's a bit like an old car, isn't it? If you own an old car, people say the best time to own when you have a vintage car is the day you get it and the day you get rid of it. The rest is every other day is a play. But you go up the shops in a Morris Minor, or you can take your Tesla. You probably won't break down in your Morris Minor, will you? You might break down your Tesla, but you know what I mean. You've got to fettle it and pull the choke out. It's the same when I'm on 40 meters. I have to wait for the drift to stop. I have to tune the pre-selector and the dip. It's not just like turning on and operating. And there's something, is it in the male personality that we like fettling things, steam engines, cars, whatever. So that's my history of old ham radio kit and why the hell we bother it. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for listening. If you haven't popped off to the loo, I'm on g3zps.com. I'm on Facebook, VMARS, obviously many of you are probably involved in. I've got a YouTube channel, which is alternates between music, and Craig Valio Radio Society. It's one of the biggest clubs. We've got our own website. So thanks very much. Back to you, Simon. I shall stop sharing.